There we are.
Alright, well, tonight we've got chapter 6 and 7. We don't have to make it through both tonight. I just figured they're both short, just a couple pages each, so we print them out and have it for next week if nothing else. But, I want to start out by reading chapter 6, as we've been doing. You grab it in its entirety and then I'll get into the commentary on it. Esther chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor and dignity had been done to Mordecai for this?" Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, "There is nothing done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman was come to the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, "Behold, Haman standeth in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, "What shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and a crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered into the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor." And the king said to Haman, "Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken." Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor." And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hastened to his house, mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, "If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him." And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hastened to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. We'll stop there for now. Sierra, if you would, go ahead and start us out. Just grab those, maybe the first couple verses to begin with, and then we'll stop for thought and question.
On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. This particular night the king had trouble sleeping. At this time the gallows were also being built. The king called for the Chronicles to be read. That is also a good example. When we have trouble sleeping, we can read God's Chronicles, his word. Perhaps God has something at that time to instruct us in. Even though Haman had planned all these things for God's people, and Satan his plan too, God will see to it that all things work for the good of those who love him. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. These things have been reported. Everything we do is reported. There is no getting God to erase things once they are written down. The thing Mordecai had told to save the king had been written down, so now they were there for the king to read. There is a position with God that we can be in which the Lord does not impute sin. We all sin, but when we are in the right position and when we ask forgiveness for those sins, they are not written down against us. So here in the records, the king read that Mordecai had done what Mordecai had done. Everything we do also be written down in the Chronicles.
Are there any questions or comments on that? If not, Tony, would you like to finish the page for us there?
And the king's, Esther 6:3 says, and the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. It was here during this reading that night that the king got it in his mind to honor Mordecai. It was in the morning that this honor was to happen. Isn't that what we are waiting for, the morning to meet Jesus and receive our reward? Mordecai had not received anything for what he had done as of yet. Neither are we to expect any kind of reward here in this world. Our reward will come at the dawning of the new day when Jesus comes. We are nothing but beggars on a dunghill for now. Esther 6:4 says, and the king said, who was in the court? Now Haman was come in to the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. His every thought was to do evil to Mordecai. Satan's every thought is to do evil to God's children, to cause them to lose their inheritance. And the king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. We see Haman had an entrance in unto the king, just like Satan has an entrance in unto God. Just like our church services, there's no way you can keep Satan from coming in.
Question or comment on that? Question. No, we'll go ahead and clear up the next section. Verse 6 says, so Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? Here's where the vanity comes in. I have known brethren who were the same way, who thought they were worthy of honor. In all of us there is vanity. Sometimes it's hard to know the difference. We go along in this life thinking we are pleasing God, when all the time we are only pleasing Satan. It is really easy to be in the right doctrine, but spiritually wrong. You can do this. But I say it's impossible to be spiritually right and wrong in doctrine. If you are right with the Spirit, He will instruct you what is right. If we follow the flesh, we might end up in any situation. Verses 7 and 8 say, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, the horse which the king rides upon, and a crown royal which is set upon his head. It seems here that it was Haman's desire to be in the king's own position. Is not this what Satan desires? To be in God's place, to exalt himself above all that is called God's? This is written in the Word. Let us put ourselves in that position, as the king was, to be able to read the Chronicles. That is, unless we are in that position, we will not understand what is written in God's Word. These things were written for the king, just like our King's Chronicles are only written for Christ and those in him. We will find Haman never got to put those things on, and neither will Satan. Anything to say about that next section there?
It's really something the way he wanted to not only wear the crown, but also have his horse.
Mhm.
Have his horse and just, like you say, take his place. That's what he tell that he was trying to do.
Yeah.
And I can't believe the king really kind of went along with it. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
to be willing to do that, you know,
Right.
I mean, that was, you know, taking a lot of the king, the look of the king away from him and onto someone else.
Yeah, it's the highest honor that could really be thought of outside of the king giving his authority to the man too, is giving him the clothes and crown and the horse.
I bet he would have got a completely different answer from Mordecai
Yeah.
if he had asked Mordecai what to do.
Yeah. I can only imagine how Haman's heart dropped when
When he found out it wasn't him.
Yeah, when he found out it wasn't him. Is there anything else to say about that? Oh,
I mean, one thing to parallel telling us the fact that, like, returning it to God, like maybe Satan doesn't present it or ask God for it, but in the sense God says we will be princes with God, and so God is willing to bestow something that we're not worthy of, something that should be good returned to us
yeah.
in that sense.
Yep. Good thoughts. Would you go ahead and grab the rest of the page for us?
And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes. They may array the man with all whom the king delighted to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus she shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. What he is saying here is really correct, even though he spoke it through vanity. These same honors will be delivered unto those who are faithful. Those who rule and reign with Christ will wear that royal apparel and that royal crown, and will be proclaimed to all the world. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate, and nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Let nothing fail. This is exactly how it will be. Our king will give us the same honor. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. This is perfect victory in Christ Jesus. Mordecai has received a victory over death. Haman had to quote this as he led Mordecai down the street. He had to tell the people that this was the man whom the king delighted to honor. All of his friends and family had to see what Haman was doing. He was completely dishonored, just as Satan will be.
Thank you. Any thoughts or questions on that portion? Haman really had to eat crow, didn't he? Tony, would you go ahead and just grab the rest of the chapter there for us?
Esther 6:12 says, And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house, mourning and having his head covered. This is a sign of dishonor, covering your head. Haman was embarrassed. 6:13 says, And Haman had told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. Now it did not take a rocket scientist to figure this out. They realized right away that Haman was not going to rebel against Mordecai. Satan cannot possibly rebel against the word and the laws of God. If we resist him, he shall flee from us. We do not have to bring railing accusations against him. We only have to resist him. Satan always tries to bring down God's people, and he always been in the business of copying the things of God. He makes false religions to fool people. They look so religious, and only God's true people who are led by the Holy Spirit can recognize them as false. Jesus said, I am the door, and no man cometh unto the Father except by me. And what does Satan do? He puts up all these false doors. And while we were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. At that very moment, they came to bring Haman to the banquet. Once things start to happen, will go pretty fast. We are getting into the part of Esther where God's people are about to come into control. And certainly in our own lives, we are getting close to that position too.
Thank you. There's an interesting picture that's drawn with what we see here, what we see with Mordecai as being a representation of the law, Haman being a representation of Satan. Think back to the garden and God telling Adam, really the one rule, right? Don't eat of this tree. Satan presenting his own words above what God had said, above the law of God. I wonder how many times Satan did that for Israel, putting his own spin on the law, putting himself in there to deceive Israel. We see here the picture that Satan might have tried to put himself above the law of God, tried to put himself in place of that. It's ultimately going to be that same action which humiliates and condemns him. Just something I thought that came to mind that I thought was interesting. Were there any other comments or questions on this section? And on this chapter?
Question, comment, I don't know how to describe it, but one thing when reading it, I did think it was interesting that Haman's wife and friends, even though Haman had this law put in place where the Israelites were going to be destroyed after this event, instead of saying something like you're going to win in the end or something, it was now seen as like, they made the comment, well, for whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him. And I thought it's an interesting thing to say when they know.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it just interested me. But that's what they would say to him in this moment, instead of like you're right at the last laugh.
I remember Dad that used to always say that, Satan will allow a person, like if you go off into another religion, he goes, well, they believe 90% like us.
Mm-hmm.
Satan's willing to give you 90%, but it's that 10% that he twists it just enough to get you to miss your mark.
Yeah.
And 90% is not 100. He'll let you go so far without, and then he'll just give you a little twist that will just be completely off the mark.
Exactly. That's all you really can do. You can't take away what we've been given. You can't take away what God has promised us. All He can really do is prevent us from receiving it in any way that it can.
Other thing I wanted to point out was the comment made of once things start to happen, they will go pretty fast. And like, at first I was like, that's a weird comment, but then like thinking about it, it's like, well, it took a year for Esther to become the chosen queen, and then I think it took another year for Haman to raise the money to then bring it before the king to ask to establish the law against the Jews, to now get to a point where everything is happening within a couple of days. I liked the point that was made, that was pointed out there.
Yeah, all this time leading up to it, but once it's time for things to happen, God is swift. That's one thing I like about the phrase, the day of the Lord. Every time you see that come up, it's talking about a longer period than 24 hours, but communicating when the time comes for the Lord to execute his judgment, it'll happen very quickly because everything's already been prepared, all judgments have been made. It's just time for us to catch up to his plan. Good thought, so. Looks like we've got a little bit of time left, so let me go ahead and open up chapter 7. Here, we'll read the entirety of chapter 7. We'll move on. We should be able to finish this in the time that we have left. If not a little bit before the hours. Chapter 5. 6. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we have been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. And the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he, that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. When the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereupon Esther was, then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in my house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. And as we go into chapter 7, I think we'll do it very much the same way we just did chapter 6. We'll read a few verses, a few thoughts on the verses, and then we'll take pause for questions and comments. Sierra, if you would, go ahead and grab those first 3 verses before us.
So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. Now remember, this had been planned by Esther. If we are saying Esther is the church, then she also represents Christ. In the gospel of God, we find in the beginning was the Word. Christ is in the Word of God. Christ is the Word that was made flesh. All things were made by him and for him. Christ has planned all this before the foundation of the world, so it will not catch God or Christ by surprise. No man knows the day, but we do know the signs. Esther has planned this and knew what was taking place. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And if it shall be granted thee, and it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Now this is the 3rd time he set this up unto half the kingdom. And this is the same thing God has promised the church. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in the sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Here again there's a stipulation which was if she found favor in his sight. If we are to rule and reign with Christ, we too must find favor in his sight, and is he who elevates or puts down. It is God who opens the door, and it is God who closes it, just like he did with the ark. So we find our ruling and reigning with Christ is how we please God. Only if we allow God to cleanse us can we enter into his presence. Only when we please God will he grant our requests or our prayers. First, Esther asked for her own life, then the life of her people. We too must come to Jesus and ask for our own life eternal before we go to him to make petitions for our loved ones.
Thank you. Is there any questions or comments on that portion? If not, Tony, would you go ahead and grab 4 through 6 for us?
Esther 7:4 says, "For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage." We too were sold into bondage by Adam. Man has always been in sin and bondage, just like Israel in Egypt. They were in bondage just as Israel was delivered from bondage from Egypt. So too are we delivered from the bondage of this world by Christ Jesus. We are on our way to being destroyed, but the blood of Christ we can be saved. This happened in the Garden of Eden. Our end was destruction, but through Christ we can change that destination in our life. Esther was saying if they were just being sold into bondage, she would have held her tongue, but they were going to be put to death. So she came before the king to make requests for their life. We will always be in bondage to this world, but we can go before God to ask for our life. Did you say through 6?
Yes, please.
Esther 7:5 says, "When the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so?" This thing that Haman had planned for God's people, you'd think that Ahasuerus represents God and his kingdom. Why didn't he know? You can only carry this to a certain point because God knows all things. But he does allow Satan to tempt us, and that is for our own good sometime, to make us stronger. If he took us and set us in a position and put a hedge around us where we can never come into evil, we would still sin in our heart. As long as we are in the flesh, we are in the bondage to sin and death. The more trials we come against, the more we can overcome. This is how we can receive our rewards. Esther 7:6 says, "And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. The only ones present here, it seems, are Esther, the king, and Haman. This represents God, the church, and Satan. These are the only ones who have an entrance.
Thank you. Is there any question or comment on that section?
When Haman signed off for the law, did he not ask? No, when Ahasuerus signed off on the law, did he not ask Haman what the law he was signing off was that he?
I don't think so. If I remember correctly, I think that was chapter 4, 3 or 4, when that came up. It seemed like Haman had no, it was that the king didn't know that Esther was a Jew. And so Haman had come to the king accusing the Jews with his law, the day of purging, as it were, against them. They came to the king about it, said these people are unruly, they're no good for the kingdom, let's get rid of them. The king signed off on the law, not realizing that Esther herself was a Jew.
Well, just looking at verse 8, and the encounter, it never says Jews. It says there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among these people. Their law is different than the kingdom's. Their law is different from all the people's. They do not keep the kingdom's laws.
There you go.
So I don't know if that's an added thing, but it doesn't necessarily say the Jews, so you didn't know they were talking about the Jews.
And which chapter was that?
3 verses 8 through
3, 8, and 9? Yeah. Yep, you are right. You left out that little detail about who those people were. Is there any other thoughts or comments on that section? If not, I'll pick up here at verse 7. The king, rising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. We're coming into a part of the study that will take us to where God's people will destroy all unrighteousness upon the face of the earth. Certainly when God comes, he will destroy all those who have opposed him from the beginning of time, or who are upon the earth at that time. Then later all the others that have died. Haman stood up to make request for his life. Satan will also stand before God to make request for his life. But the penalty has already been determined. What will happen to Haman and all his family, and it has already been determined what will happen to Satan and all those who follow him. All who stand before the judgment seat of Christ, if they have not already had their life given to them, they will die. Verse 8, then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of the wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will they force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. There he was in darkness, not even seeing where he was being taken, speechless. Well, Satan is used to being in bed here on earth with all the harlots, all the false churches. Anytime we even look at or consider a false teaching, God calls it going a whoring. Haman's doom was sealed. Satan's doom is also sealed. Israel constantly went after strange doctrines and false religions. They got right in there worshiping and even sacrificing their own children to these false gods. That's why God finally gave up on them and cut them off. There was always a remnant to believe God. Is there any question or comment on this section? If not, real quick, Sierra, would you grab the last 2 verses for us?
And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold, for also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. Now this gallows that was so high, the one which Haman had planned to hang Mordecai, so that all the city could see it, was now where Haman was to be hung. This is the same way Satan will be put away. It will be visible to all people. There was no hesitation. It happened right then, and this was just. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. God's wrath too will be pacified when Satan's end comes, and he is punished. In this next chapter 8, we are getting into where God's people will possess the land. This is what God's people are to pray for, that his kingdom will come. This is what God has planned from before the creation and is something we should long for.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments on that final section, on the chapter as a whole? If not, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.